Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the CRAM podcast. CRAM is an acronym for Communicating Research and More, which is what we try and do on this podcast. A lot of exciting research and groundbreaking ideas never reach the public, but they have the potential to change the way we think and act. One of the things that I love about doing this podcast is that I not only learn about some of the incredibly exciting and innovative projects being done by Canadian researchers, but I get a glimpse inside their minds as to how they see the world. And I'm very eager to get into the mind of Nina Marie Lister. How does she see our world, our communities, even a street for that matter? And how can these environments offer a harmonious relationship between their inhabitants and the world around them? I hope she doesn't mind if I say this question has been foundational to her life's work. From designing wildlife crossings, including the world's largest that will offer safe passage for endangered animals, to supporting the development of a park system that will connect green spaces and communities, to changing city bylaws to support biodiversity. These are large, complex projects with many moving parts, and we're going to dive into them with Nina Marie Lister. She's a professor in the School of Urban and Regional Planning and director of the Ecological Design Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University. She's also a visiting professor with the Graduate School of Design at Harvard and joins me. Hello, Nina Marie.
Hello, Mary. What a lovely introduction. Thank you.
Oh, well, it's great to have you here. I was thinking about, all the work that you're doing, and I wondered to myself, how did this all begin? I mean, how did you actually get interested in this area?
Wow. I have to say that some of the greatest stories in life are unplanned. They're circuitous adventures that sometimes you even back into. And that's probably how I did this. I was a left brain, right brain child and still am a mixed up adult, meaning to say that I love and work across both the arts and sciences. When I was a kid, I probably showed a more promise than some in the sciences, and not so much in the maths, but in the sciences. And I had a really inquiring mind, and I got really supported and pushed into the sciences, but at the expense of art, actually. And no matter how hard I tried, an interest in the design disciplines and in making things, really thinking, making, and doing, constantly came back. So I ended up working, for better or for worse, across the disciplines, both in the arts and in the sciences, in my adult life. And these projects tend to find you. So, for example, one of the projects I got asked to participate in was to help with a design competition for the world's first wildlife crossing, a bridge in Vail, Colorado. And no one had ever done this before. And someone recommended me as someone who could think about both design and science at the same time. And since no one had done it before, why not me? So that's really how I backed into this stuff. But of course, there are other threads as well.
Yeah, no, we're definitely going to get more into your work with wildlife crossings. But I want to talk about something you said, and that we're living in this time of tremendous urgency. Now, I've heard this described in different ways by other researchers, but I'm interested in hearing what you mean by urgency, considering the work that you do.
Well, urgency is exactly the right word. Some might even say emergency. We are, of course, in a climate emergency. We recognize that it's well established in sciences, and it's supported by evidence all around us if we choose to look. And of course, we are also staring down at an extinction abyss. We're losing species faster than we can count them. We've lost half our bird species since 1970. So it really is an urgent time in which we have a choice to act. And it's also an amazing time of opportunity when some of the old rules perhaps don't apply anymore. We don't necessarily wait for all of the sciences in one specialized discipline to have the answers, but rather we collaborate. We build bridges and we jump fences, as I like to think about it. So there's an opportunity in the crisis, as many will say. And for me, this is hopeful and opportunistic as much as it is really urgent. I'd also add that in this moment in particular, I'd say that the risk of not doing anything is very high. And so the risk of experimentation perhaps carries a different perspective. And when urgency is around us, in other words, there's a risk of action and there's also a risk of not doing anything, and there's high uncertainty, it means we need to develop new tools and try new opportunities for solutions. And that's what we're doing. We're adapting, we're experimenting. And for me, at least, when we experiment, we need to make sure we do so safely. So failing safely is a big part of, for me, the mandate. Try wildly with crazy ideas, but make sure that when you fail, it's safe.
And how does that action take shape with regards to our cities and thinking about how we plan or redesign aspects of our cities in their relationship with nature?
Well, an excellent way to apply some of this knowledge is all around us in the way that we choose to live. And when I say that we're taking experiments, I mean to say that let's try and connect our landscapes in ways that we haven't done before. We've tended to, plan park areas in certain parts of the city and not really think about leftover or derelict areas as having potential. So there's an opportunity for experimentation, temporary uses, landscapes that offer an opportunity for respite, for connection between two busy pathways, for example, or landscapes that are left over in some way after a development. There are lots of ways that we can connect green spaces through our city to offer people a chance to be close to nature. Even as the city grows up and densifies, we can do a lot more with our landscapes, not only on the ground level, but in our rooftops, in our walls, in the way we move water along the streetscape, for example. These all have opportunities for building differently with nature.
Do you think that the pandemic brought home the realization for many people how important nature is in our lives?
Most definitely. Certainly anecdotally, you heard that all over social media. But when people are talking about their feelings on social media, they're expressing how they feel in real time. And I think researchers have picked up on this to note where those trends are. In the pandemic, during confinement and quarantine, people had limited access to the things they took for granted. And there's no question that we've seen evidence in a spike in activities from everything from forest bathing to bird watching to engaging with nature in kind of passive ways that don't require a lot of equipment, but allowed people to be outside and perhaps hearing and seeing differently. And that's, for me, a really important measure of how people engage in the world, is how they report their response to nature. So people who for a long time might have never really paid attention to birdsong, if you ask them about it, they might say, oh yeah, the birds are singing. But after the pandemic, they might have been able to tell you that they heard a cardinal or that they know what a chickadee looks like because they actually paid attention. They paid attention in a different way than they had before. And they might actually, we find, at least in some of the research I'm looking at, that they might actually have a different sense of empathy or compassion towards nature. And that's also means towards each other, which is a positive thing.
Yeah. Well, and so an example too, I guess, of this is the Meadowway project that, you've been involved with. Can you talk about that and how you see that whole connection of parks and green spaces, working to connect people and animals, nature, everything with each other?
Well, let me say first that we all need freedom to roam. This was made very clear during the pandemic, and that includes, of course, different species of wildlife. And we all move. If you think about the busyness of a city, not just in terms of traffic, but in terms of people activity, economic activity, the kind of thickness of a city, how dense it is, where the roads are, where the places you can walk are, where is there a place that's quiet? These are all indicators that we perhaps can't move as freely as we might want to. So people find ways to move. Surprisingly, they create their own pathways sometimes. Have you ever been to a park where there's a paved pathway and then you see all these footprints and trails through the park? Those are what we call desire lines, where people actually want to go. And as it turns out, people and wildlife sometimes use those same pathways, although we might use them at different times. So if you imagine the city as a 24-hour symphony, there's going to be different music at different times. In other words, people are going to be moving, wildlife are going to be moving. We move at different times and different speeds throughout the city. So we know that healthy ecosystems to a certain extent are connected. And just like we need to connect our neighborhoods for the healthy exchange of people and goods, we also know that wildlife need those same connections for breeding, for feeding, for refuge. And so good design in a city means that we all need to be able to move at different speeds in a way that's safe and also freeing. Think about how it is to move with a stroller or on a pair of rollerblades or on a bicycle. Those are different speeds, and we need to be able to do so without running into each other, and at the same time to feel like we really have the freedom of the city and nature at our doorstep. Wildlife also need that. And so a lot of my work involves understanding the patterns of our movement and how we can actually connect those spaces, not just for freedom and safety, but as it turns out, also for health. Think about physical fitness.
Yeah. Okay. This sounds to me, to my untrained ears, incredibly complicated. Because yeah, you're right. I mean, people move in different ways. What attracts them is different. What attracts animals is different. How they move is different. And I remember you said once too that living systems are inherently unpredictable. So how do you then create a system, a design system that can accommodate that
Well,
effectively?
that's a tricky question. To say that they're unpredictable, that's true. What I would say in the urban area is that our ability to predict how natural systems will evolve is limited. But when we are designing with them in our cities, we have some aspects of control. And so we can use how we understand living systems to inform better design for not just people, but for wildlife. And by this, I mean, our parks need to be connected. Our ability to move from the green belt to the waterfront in Toronto, for example, or in Montreal from the plateau down to the water, or in Vancouver from Stanley Park out through the city burbs and into the mountains. Those are all pathways for people, for wildlife, and a good design doesn't isolate our communities. As people, we understand that intuitively, but really contemporary urban design can do both things. We can move water safely. We can move it in ways that is safe to slow and hold it in a rainstorm or a flash flood, that allows vegetation to flourish, that connects our parks from a beautiful walkway or a shaded streetway that provides a comfortable climate for us in the summertime, and in the winter provides a little bit of wind shelter, for example. These are all spaces that wildlife need as well. And just to go back for a minute to the Meadowway, Mary, that was a great question, because the Meadowway is an excellent example of a piece of kind of utility infrastructure in the city, a hydro corridor, right? That's a really
Mhm.
important piece of infrastructure, but it has more than one use. Underneath those power lines exists low vegetation that harbors all kinds of birds, butterflies, pollinators, even amphibians. And guess what? It allows people to walk across their neighborhoods in ways that aren't on roadways. So there's a whole other opportunity in this corridor that used to be called a hydro corridor that is effectively rebranded as the Meadowway. It connects priority neighborhoods and people that have a very low supply of high quality urban parks in their backyards, that allows movement through the city in a way that actually runs not with the roadways, but across them and through them and under the valleys and over the streams. It's a really beautiful idea to be able to use that for people. And that's just one project. I'm one of hundreds of people involved with that project. So we helped to think about the design for connectivity.
Yeah, can you be specific and tell us what exactly happens, let's say, when you have one green space, maybe it's a park and then another one, and now the two actually are connected. What will happen?
That's a really good question. When we think of parks, as some people have described them as, imagine Central Park, a jewel all by itself. But of course, the jewel in the crown is what we're after in really good park design. Even some of the most famous park designers over the years have tried to make connected greenways. And the reason for this is even to allow, for example, pollinators to move, butterflies, creatures that fly, to move from one area where there's a food source to another. So you immediately provide greater opportunities for a wider range of other life forms to move and find habitat. For people, we can't all be crowded into one park. We might want to go for a circuitous jog. We might want to be able to run safely without ever having to be on a crowded roadway. So parks that are linear, like in our ravine systems, for example, those make a lot of sense for us. So what happens is we unlock opportunity. for movement and, as it turns out, for health. And not just for physical fitness, but also for our mental health. Again, something that was revealed very
Mhm.
clearly during the pandemic, that we actually need to be in quiet green spaces for our mental health. We know that our cortisol levels go down. We know that children's ability to pay attention is greater in these spaces. And rather than just being locked in an area that is, let's say, fenced in or an island on which you sit, it's healthy for us to be able to move through those spaces and to take advantage of the neighborhood connections. Sometimes it's as simple as being able to connect from one neighborhood to another without having to get in your car and drive.
You know, when I think about big projects like Meadoway, connecting these spaces, I mean, they sound grand, um, but yeah, just from what you're saying, they can affect the smallest of the small, right?
Yes.
Meaning organisms that we don't even notice or maybe even see. So, like, how do you take into account all the variety and the variability of life that will be affected by this kind of change in the environment? Is it always good, or is there a downside you have to be careful about?
Well, some might argue, some ecologists would argue that in certain places, too much connectivity is not great because you might, for example, be opening up pathways for invasive species that could do harm to an ecosystem. I mean, to a certain extent, that has happened. We can think of examples, but there are far more examples of wildlife species, and arguably, if we carry the argument to people, when you're cut off from your kin, or you're cut off as a community from your resources, from supermarkets, I mean, you can always make an analogy for people here. If you're cut off, you don't do as well. And there's been some lots of examples in cities where wildlife and people coexist. And when wildlife lose their opportunity for breeding success or feeding to find a mate, to find food resources, to make territory, as large cats do, for example, uh, they can very quickly have an unfit or unhealthy population that eventually dies off. And so, for example, this can happen at all scales, as you say, from very small pollinating insects that have small patches of habitat to much wider ranging species like the monarch butterfly that is continental in its breeding success, for example. The California cougar, the mountain lion that's been made
Right.
famous in Los Angeles. The bridge that we worked on as a team, this is very much an enormous collaborative effort, contributed to some of the advice on that design. That was specifically designed to capture many species in reconnecting an isolated piece of habitat in Los Angeles to the mountains behind the city. And
Yeah,
the
can you just talk about that? What was the problem? Like, what was the problem, and then how
yeah.
did you and others see the solution to that?
To your question about how wildlife and people move, like why do we need connected spaces? A good example would be in California, the mountain lion that's famous in Hollywood called P22. This is a mountain lion that's been followed for many years by researchers. And as it turns out, as a young male, he wandered into Los Angeles looking to expand his territory, which is what breeding males do. But unfortunately, he couldn't easily find a larger territory in the metropolitan city of Los Angeles. He settled right around the Hollywood sign. You might have seen a very famous photograph by the National Geographic photographer Steve Winter that shows this cougar right in front of the Hollywood sign. That's P22. And the headlines that go along with that story are, he was a lonely cougar looking for love in Los Angeles, only he's a young male in this case, because he couldn't cross the 16-lane highway to get back to the mountain ranges that would have much access to much larger habitat. So what happens is that we isolate, fragment habitats. We break them up into smaller and smaller pieces so that wildlife cannot move safely. They can't cross the roads. They can't cross through fenced areas. And this becomes one of the ways that they die out in urbanizing landscapes. So what can we do? We can design connections. And some of those are bridges. Some of those are underpasses. Some of them are connected ravine systems. There are lots of ways to do this.
And how do you know which is the right way?
Excellent question. That's where good research comes in. In my case, I'm an interdisciplinary researcher, and I rely a lot on research that's collected by ecologists that are very specific to those different species we're talking about. So we can use the research of tracking, following where do these wildlife move, which species move, how do they like to move. There's lots of excellent primary or basic research studies that show how particular species like to move. For example, we know that black bears prefer a different kind of crossing habitat to grizzly bears. Grizzly bears are essentially, they like big open spaces, so they will tend to use a crossing structure that has an open top, like a wide open space. And there's actually a very specific number about how much space they need. Similarly, some species will use tunnels. Cougars will use tunnels. White-tailed deer don't like tunnels, for example. So some species like to be able to see light on the other end of the passage in which they're taking. So there's a lot of science behind it, and it's done by many different researchers. And in design, we look at that research to inform and influence with evidence the best designs that are possible under certain circumstances.
That is so fascinating, because I've always wondered, this is probably a really dumb question, but when I'm driving in rural areas and then you see the sign that will say deer crossing or whatever, and I always wonder, well, how much of that road are like, do you know what I mean? Like, why did they pick that specific area? What went into the decision of putting the sign right there? And for how long are we supposed to be careful? Like I've wondered about that because all you see is the sign.
Well, you have tapped into the most common mitigation method we have, which is signage. And that is what's used ubiquitously across roads in North America and the world. And in fact, you can Google all kinds of amusing varieties of wildlife crossing signs for different countries all over the world, everything from crocodiles to sloths to deer. And most of those signs are put up based on two things. One, anecdotal evidence. People who live in an area, they're crash reported, for example. Then the next one will be what we call wildlife cameras that are put up, trail cameras that capture images of wildlife attempting to cross or crossing roads at a certain point. Usually, when enough anecdotal reports or accident reports have come in, a local wildlife service or agency will begin to monitor those sites so that you get a sense of how many what we call wildlife vehicle collisions are happening. And these are problems that affect everyone, not just, of course, the wildlife who are killed or injured, but also people who can be killed or injured depending on the size of the animal. So these signs are really the best we can do in a very quick and dirty way. And they rely very much on the attentiveness of a driver like you, who's actually asking, I wonder how long this sign goes on for. I don't know the answer to that. It really depends on the species. There are other methods, but that's the most common one used.
I didn't even realize. I did an interview recently because it's the fall and the crossings increase in the fall up north in Ontario. And I did this interview and I had no idea the thousands and thousands of collisions that take place just in Ontario alone
Yes.
between wildlife and cars, it resulting in, well, even death, right? Death, injury, serious injuries.
Yeah, the numbers are staggering. I mean, we collect the data across North America as well. And we know also from an economic point of view, the problem is staggering. It is an $8 billion a year problem in North America. And that includes the cost of insurance premiums, of the crash itself, the recovery of the remains, the cleanup crews on the roads. This is pretty grisly stuff. It's a very expensive problem and it doesn't go away. It happens again and again. Unlike, for example, a problem that could be solved with a piece of infrastructure. So that's one of the reasons the work that we do, and in particular the organization that I work closely with through my research, which is called ARC, the Animal Road Crossing Project, we're very concerned about the number of collisions that happen across the continent and ways in which we can actually stop them once and for all. The evidence is really good that well-designed infrastructure that's put in the right place for the right species is well over 90% effective when it's installed correctly. And that solves the problem for good. So it's a very worthwhile monetary investment in wildlife crossing infrastructure. It also, of course, helps people, saves lives, and bonus, it reconnects those two ecosystems or habitats or the landscape on either side of the road.
You talk, when talking about infrastructure, you talk a lot about green infrastructure. Can you talk specifically about what that means?
Yes. If you think about all of the investments we make in our city and you ask people, what is stuff we build in the city? You might say, well, we build roads, bridges, pipelines, sewers, buildings, that sort of thing. We think of that as gray infrastructure generally because it's the color of the concrete or the cement or the materials that we make it from. Green infrastructure is alive. So it's also an investment. It's putting money into something that's purpose designed or purposely conserved in some cases. I work in the kind of infrastructure that is typically designed. So it has human agency. We do something to create it. It's engineered, it's landscape architecture, it's ecology, but it's alive in some way. So perhaps its surface is living vegetation. Or in the case of a green roof, it might be layers of vegetation, including a tree canopy, for example. Wildlife crossing infrastructure is a particular kind of green infrastructure that has a vegetated surface usually, or that connects two types of habitats with a piece of like a concrete tunnel, for example, and you can use corrugated steel piping. You could use box culverts. Sometimes they're really innovative bridges that are made from lightweight fiber reinforced plastic material. Sometimes they're modular. So you can be very creative with this kind of infrastructure. But the key is that it's in some way combined with living material. That's green.
Yeah. And do you think that the pandemic has given us more of an appetite to embrace green infrastructure
I,
and not just sort of citizens, but also governments, business? What's your sense?
I do. In fact, we've seen lots of evidence even before the pandemic. Certainly, the government of Canada has recognized that investments in our social and green infrastructure are as important as in our built infrastructure of other forms. And that's particularly because we know that Canada has a commitment to climate resilience. We have made global commitments to protecting biodiversity. In fact, 30% by 2030 is our latest convention goal. So there are ways to achieve these goals by building with and for nature that also invests in our future as individual people and as a collective society. The investments in green infrastructure are very real. In the United States right now, they've also made similar commitments federally and specifically to the alleviation of wildlife vehicle collisions with infrastructure that's related to our roads, partly because we're building a lot of them. And we know that we need to mitigate, given what we talked about earlier, the number of collisions that occur and the declining populations of wildlife in many places across our countries, some of which, honestly, are on literally a collision course with biodiversity. So the hot spots of the world that contain the most or richest species diversity are also some of the fastest growing, building the most number of roads. So we really need to turn our attention to a creative way to build to support a biodiverse and rich landscape.
Hmm. And aren't you involved with your wildlife crossings work abroad as well, in other countries?
Yes. Through the ARC project that my research lab works closely with, we're partners. We worked in California, as I said, to support the design of the world's largest supercrossing. But we're also taking some of that work into other countries, specifically in Latin America, where we're looking at connecting North and South America. Those roadways are going through, and we're also looking at mitigating a large number of highways that are happening in Colombia, for example, right down through Chile and Argentina. We're also connected to a project that is in Malaysia for the Asian elephant. My colleagues at ARC are very closely advising governments throughout Thailand and China, and also in India and Nepal, for example, with very important biodiverse landscapes that will connect the continent, really, for highways that will be, whether we like it or not, moving to 4 lanes or greater. And elephants need space to roam too, particularly in countries that have a high cultural value for certain species like tigers or elephants. The theory is if we can build bridges to protect wildlife and also to protect us as motorists and passengers, we do a good job for everyone. And inevitably, we'll get the smaller creatures along with them. That's the theory, at least. And we're seeing that happen in many places.
Wow, it's amazing, and you really walk the talk too, because I mean, you even used your own home and your front lawn as an example of what you're willing to do to fight for biodiversity, right? Can you talk
Well,
about, yeah, what happened there? Because this is, I guess, what, a few years ago when some people complained about the state of your front lawn to the city.
Well, Mary, I don't have a lawn, so that might be where we could start.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
we live in a time where every little bit matters and where anything we can do to provide an opportunity to be closer to the diversity of species that ultimately are connected to our own health, this is a good thing. It's good for people. It's good for the planet. And all I did was grow a very diverse front yard, what I like to think of as a healthy yard. So I planted a lot of native species, and I did so in part because I didn't really want to have to worry about maintaining a lawn. I don't even own a lawnmower. So it seemed to make sense to allow other species to come in and to flourish at different heights of shrubs and trees and plants. And lots of people do this. I'm by no means a leader in this. Lots of people have naturalized their yards. And they've done so sometimes as a community, but oftentimes, depending on the neighborhood you live in, you might be the first person to do it, which can be upsetting to your neighbors if they expect your house to look a certain way. But hey, if you do it for the planet, it can be good for your soul as much as for the neighborhood. So that was one initiative, but I would tell this story, Mary, in a way that provides an example and opportunities for people to learn that you don't have to do something grand or huge or on a scale of the entire ravine system. You can do something right outside your doorstep. And so if everybody naturalized even a small piece of their yard, who is a homeowner or renting a house, that's an enormous opportunity for connectivity across a community. So it really is an effort that can scale across landscapes, from the individual house to the whole neighborhood to the city.
Well, I brought it up because that incident actually became part of your work. Because I didn't even realize this until I heard about your story, that it was contravening some city bylaw because the plants that you were growing were higher than what was allowed at that time. Um, but you fought that, didn't you?
I did, and I did so because, well, let me just say, I have a position of privilege in that at the time I was the director of our program in planning, our graduate program in planning, and I thought, well, good heavens, if I am going to be charged with violating a bylaw that planners wrote, then I think I might have something to say about that. And I knew that the bylaw was actually illegal. It just hadn't been tested by anyone, at least not for a long time. And for our listeners to understand in very simple terms, bylaws are generally written to enforce a kind of conformity to a code of behavior or the way we want something to look. And with property standards, this is the category of bylaw, they usually, or for a long time, have said that you must cut your grass to 8 inches or 20 centimeters, and you must not have weeds. Well, there are two big problems with that. What do you mean by grass? Which species? Because there are many of them, and naturally, most of them don't flower until they're well over 20 centimeters. And if they're native grasses, they could be very tall. The second part of that problem is, what's a weed? There's no
Yeah.
scientific definition for a weed. And if you're going to have a law, you have to be able to enforce it with evidence. So it was relatively easy for me, a person who knows about those things, to take on that bylaw. And I did so really to offer everyday people an opportunity to see that we should be able to support biodiversity for the health of the planet on our own front yard. And as it turns out, we can. And so the bylaw is now much more facilitative of biodiversity. We now have a bylaw that, if it isn't exactly for biodiversity, but it now supports it. So you can now grow pretty much anything you like in your front yard, and there's no requirement to cut it to a certain height. Only if you have turf grass must you mow it.
Hmm. But you're also championing this cause with other municipalities as well, right?
Yes. In fact, this is one of those examples that brings us full circle. You asked, how do you get into this? How did I start doing this work? And this is the perfect example of something I backed into. It found me. I didn't really go looking for it. And as a result, I found I have been able to use some of that experience to really help other people. I've been lucky enough to work with some excellent graduate students who've really taken up the charge on this, so to say. In fact, one of my students, Carly Murphy, as part of her master's research, she wrote a model bylaw, which we have shared with municipalities all across Ontario. I have another student working with me right now, Elise Cook, who's doing also more work on understanding how bylaws can really be reformed to not only allow biodiversity, but to create social and cultural opportunities that are more inclusive, for example, to people who want to grow food on their front lawns, for example, front yards. So this work has real uptake. I also think that in a time of climate anxiety and biodiversity extinction crisis, people need to feel that there is an opportunity at your fingertips in the soil right outside your door. And as it turns out, there's a lot we can do. So this work actually is very fulfilling, and it's, I think, very empowering to people who can sometimes feel crushed by the weight of a small bylaw that has big impact.
I wonder. Well, I think I saw a picture of your house and the front garden because of it became a news story, and I was looking at it the other day, that story, and it made me think about my own street. I live in the city, and I don't think there's anything unusual about my street. I have neighbors who are close by. Maybe there are about 40 houses on my street. I've got a front yard, there's a backyard, there's a driveway. But I imagine, when you look at a street, you see it very differently from the way I would see a street. And I wonder how you see the potential of a street, of a street with a different design, thinking about nature, thinking about it in an organic way. Like, how do you envision an, I don't know if I want to call it ideal street, but, a street that is compatible with all its inhabitants, whether they're human or not?
That's a lovely way to ask the question. In planning, we do think of what we call complete streets or green streets that are generally inclusive. It means that someone with a stroller or in a wheelchair or a walker is safe to move along that street. Similarly, that the car isn't the only thing on the street, that there is perhaps a bicycle way that's separate from where the cars are, that there's a transit way depending on the width of the street. If we extend that to thinking about the natural world, to birds, to pollinating insects, to butterflies and moths, to small mammals, we add another layer of what I would call richness, and maybe engineers would call complexity, to the street. And truly, it becomes a place that has multiple levels of movement, from a tree canopy that provides shade, from room under the street to allow the roots of the trees to absorb water and to grow and actually to connect to each other, so that there's a kind of ecological connectivity in the community. And that the street grade, if you think about it, wouldn't all be asphalt. It might be asphalt in the center for cars, but then there may be also some porous material, that you might have a place for rain to be managed as a resource, that rain is a gift when it falls. That water, we need it, and we need it to be slower and to be held within the soil, not rushing off and creating a risk for people downstream. So there are lots of ways we could look at the street. I might think about looking at the street from the bird's eye. Is there a place for me to land safely? Is there a tree that has a place for nesting? Is there a spot are there thickets and shrubs that allow smaller creatures? I might also think about it from the frog's eye view. Is there a spot for slowing and holding water? Those things are not antithetical to the city. Even though we might think they are, opportunities abound for us to rethink the way we interface with nature. And that can begin at the street level, actually.
And what about we as urban dwellers who live on that street, but we're not experts, we're not urban planners, designers. What part can we play in making that happen?
I think it depends on your street, Mary, but I would say we all actually have an opportunity here. If you think about streets in some of the suburban locations where the sidewalk is split from the road, do you know what I mean? Where there's what we call a boulevard, or some people call it a green strip or a right of way. If you look around communities, even in Toronto, I like to bike around and look for those streets. And there's a few of them downtown even that have a split sidewalk. And you'll notice that people take over that boulevard. They do things like plant flowers there, or some communities get together and put vegetables in. And now technically, that's not your land. It usually belongs to the city, but homeowners actually have a responsibility to manage that land. Those areas are also part of city policy and bylaws. And even just taking them over in a way that's hospitable for other species extending your garden, as it were, can be really rewarding. Not every city allows this, but many have a kind of don't ask, don't worry policy. In other words, if the vegetation isn't so high that it would obstruct the view from a driver, it's usually quite acceptable. So there are things you can do like that. You can plant things in the boulevard. You could take out your lawn or a piece of your lawn even. There are also things you can advocate for in your community. If there's a small park that in your community, even a parkette, there are things that community groups can do. Even, for example, everything from, the spring trash pickup to asking the city to take out the annual plants and allow the community to take over the garden. So there are lots of things possible.
It's interesting what you say. It actually reminds me of something that a medical researcher once said to me. We were talking about the potential for happiness, a human happiness. And he said that there are fundamentally two things that make people happy. One is our connection with others. And the second thing was our sense that we have some control over our lives. And I think about your work and the work of others, like yourself. If those things are true, how would you say your work might contribute to that?
That's a beautiful question. At the end of the day, I hope that my work contributes to making the planet a healthier, more beautiful place where everyone can not just survive, but thrive and flourish. And flourishing is a big theme within some of the work that I do. I work with a group called the Biophilic Cities Network, and my colleague Tim Beatley has done a lot of work on this connection. And for me, the idea that we want to build cities that allow flourishing means, by definition, that we're connected to other species in some way, that we see them as an extension of a healthy and beautiful place to live, that there's birdsong. So contributing that way is really important. And it doesn't have to be grand or enormously connected, although it's nice when those things happen. It really is important that individual people feel that they have agency, that they have the capacity to engage that connection in some way. And for me, those connections are designed or material and just happens to be in what I do. But that's a legacy. And that's also a really important gift that connects well beyond one person's research. So much of what I do is highly collaborative. And that's also a theme within flourishing, I would say, that this work is never done by any one person or one discipline. It's really about sharing. And with that, of course, I think comes compassion for other species and other people. That brings
What
me
makes
joy.
you happiest? Yeah, and what makes you happiest with the work that you do?
Oh, seeing a landscape that is alive and that is flourishing in its own way, even if it's unconventional or unexpected. When I look back through my photographs of various sites and projects that I've worked on, I'm constantly amazed at how many weird photos I've taken of a small wetland in a parking lot, for example, that has just emerged over time because of the saggy pothole that got filled in. And those inspire me as to how we can design in this way, not by creating potholes, but by allowing the sort of accidental nature to come in and seeing that it is actually not that difficult. We can find ways to make space for nature. That to me is really fulfilling. And it's also sometimes in its most beautiful way, surprising. It emerges.
Okay, finally, just one little request from me. Is there some way you could incorporate some dance maybe in these spaces you create or these bridges or crossings? What happened to dance? I love dancing.
I love that. Well, that has to happen. We have to have some kind of performance art now where
Yeah.
when we open the next wildlife crossing, we have an interpretive dance. We invite the theater company to come in and interpret wildlife moving for us. I don't know, you got me thinking now. In a serious way, Mary, a lot of the work that I've been doing just in the last little while has begun to explore ways to reach people about the engagement with nature who wouldn't normally want that. In other words, when people go to an art gallery or to a museum or their interest in their pursuits might have anything to do with anything except wildlife, I find that interesting. I think, how can we reach them? The science
Hmm.
isn't very interesting for some people. And even when it is, perhaps we're not listening very well. So, are there ways we can do so through the arts? Part of ecological design is very much thinking about ways to reach new audiences with a different message about connecting to nature. So, dance it is.
It was great speaking with you, Nina Marie. Would someone give this woman a TED Talk? Please, please.
No one's ever asked, they never called. So,
Oh
but I
my
got to
goodness.
be on the Mary Ito show. So, I'm feeling pretty good about that.
Thank you so much and all the best with your many projects. I hope we can chat again sometime.
I hope so too. Thank you so much. What a great conversation.
That's Nina Marie Lister. She is a professor in the School of Urban and Regional Planning and director of the Ecological Design Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University. She's also a visiting professor with the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. For more information on Nina Marie's work here in Canada and around the world, please check out our show notes. That's it for this edition of the Cram Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. Our thanks to the Temerty Foundation for their generous support. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.